Ronnie Van Zant wore Neil Young t-shirts on stage. He called him an inspiration. He genuinely admired the man. So what turned that admiration into one of rock's most legendary confrontations? What could make a devoted fan pick up a pen and fire back at his own idol in front of millions? The answer involves pride, identity, a region under attack, and two songs that changed rock history forever. Born into rough streets. Born on January 15, 1948, in Jacksonville, Florida, Ronnie Van Zant was the son of Lacey and Marion Van Zant. Life on Jacksonville's west side wasn't always easy. It was a rough, working-class environment where fistfights and neighborhood scuffles were simply part of growing up. Toughness wasn't optional. It was survival. Fortunately, Ronnie came from a family that understood exactly what that meant. His father, Lacey, earned a living as a truck driver, but before that, he had spent time as a prize fighter. He believed his sons needed to know how to defend themselves, and he started teaching Ronnie how to box when he was barely old enough to tie his own shoes. Lacey later recalled that Ronnie was incredibly intelligent but had a fiery temper. If something didn't go his way, he reacted immediately and passionately. Rather than trying to tame that fire completely, Lacey taught him how to channel it. That combination of discipline and aggression became part of Ronnie's personality. It also explains why he admired Muhammad Ali so deeply. Ali wasn't just a champion fighter, he was fearless, outspoken, and impossible to ignore. Those were qualities Ronnie respected. But before music took over his life, another dream had captured his attention: baseball. Ronnie was good, really good. He played American Legion ball and showed genuine promise as an athlete. He later reflected that the next step could have been Double-A baseball. He had one of the highest batting averages in the league and a powerful throwing arm to match. For a while, it looked like the baseball field might become his future. Thankfully for music fans everywhere, fate had other plans. As a boy, Ronnie often rode alongside his father on trucking trips, listening to the radio for hours at a time. Those long drives exposed him to countless songs and artists, planting seeds that would eventually grow into something much bigger. Music wasn't just entertainment to him, it became an obsession. Before he ever stepped onto a real stage, though, his earliest performances took place somewhere far less glamorous: the family bathtub. According to his mother, Marion, Ronnie and his siblings loved gathering around instruments, but their favorite place to sing was while splashing around in the tub. Even then, he wasn't shy about making himself heard. Unfortunately, his audience didn't always appreciate the performance. On his very first day of school, Ronnie couldn't resist singing popular tunes right in the middle of class. While other children tried to pay attention, he carried on with his impromptu concert. The disruption caused such chaos that he ended up being punished, forcing his mother to pay the school a visit. Even as a child, there was no switch to turn the music off. It simply lived inside him. By the age of 16, Ronnie had already begun showing another trait that would define his career: leadership. He formed his first band, appropriately named Us, and naturally claimed the role of lead singer. The group didn't last long. Most teenagers might have viewed that as a sign to move on. Ronnie saw it as a reason to start over. Soon, he joined forces with Bob Burns, Gary Rossington, Alan Collins, and Larry Junstrom to create another band called My Backyard. Some of the musicians were barely teenagers, with a few as young as 13, but age didn't seem to matter. What they lacked in experience, they made up for with determination. When they weren't in school, and sometimes even when they should have been, they devoted themselves completely to music. Eventually, My Backyard evolved into a new group called the Noble Five. They started landing gigs at local dances, often earning little more than enough money for gas and a few drinks. Still, every performance sharpened their skills and strengthened their chemistry. Not everyone enjoyed the noise, however. Practice sessions moved from one parent's garage to another as the young musicians searched for places where they could play uninterrupted. Ronnie's powerful voice carried through entire neighborhoods, and before long, frustrated neighbors began filing complaints. Gary Rossington later remembered that authorities regularly shut down their rehearsals after school. Most bands might have taken the hint. This group simply found another place to play. With support from Ronnie's father, they relocated to an abandoned house on a farm outside Jacksonville. The building was old, cramped, and unbearably hot, but to the band, it was perfect. They called it Hell House, and in many ways, it became their proving ground. Inside that weathered little building, Ronnie transformed a group of enthusiastic teenagers into disciplined musicians. Every morning, often before most people had even finished breakfast, he would pull up in his battered 1955 Chevy truck to collect his bandmates. They would stop by the donut shop where his mother worked to grab coffee before heading out to rehearse. Then the real work began. Practice sessions stretched 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours at a time. Weekends disappeared, entire days blurred into nights. Occasionally, they wouldn't make it home until the following morning. Far from the quiet routines of suburban life, Hell House became their boot camp. The Noble Five played louder, pushed harder, and chased perfection with relentless determination. They were building something special. The only problem was that they still hadn't quite figured out who they were. The unexpected birth of Skynyrd. During those early years, Ronnie Van Zant and his bandmates were constantly searching for something. Surprisingly, it wasn't their sound they were struggling to find, it was their identity. The group kept landing gigs around Jacksonville, but almost every performance came with a different name attached to it. One week, they were the Wildcats. The next, they were the Sons of Satan. Then came names like Conqueror Worm, the Pretty Ones, and even 1%. The musicians were experimenting with every possible image, trying to discover who they really were. The answer arrived in the most unlikely way imaginable, through a long-running feud with a high school gym teacher. When they weren't spending endless hours rehearsing at Hell House, Van Zant and his friends were busy testing the patience of administrators at Robert E. Lee High School. All of the future Lynyrd Skynyrd members attended the school except Alan Collins, and none of them were particularly interested in following the strict dress code. The rules were rigid, hair couldn't touch the collar, sideburns couldn't extend below the ears, shirts had to stay tucked in, belts were mandatory, socks were required at all times. For teenagers who were obsessed with rock music and determined to look the part, those rules felt unbearable. Van Zant found a creative solution. Before school, he would coat his hair with Vaseline and slick it back tightly enough to make it appear shorter than it really was. Most teachers never noticed the difference. The gym coach, however, wasn't fooled. After physical education classes, students were required to shower, and the water quickly washed away the Vaseline. Suddenly, those carefully hidden locks were hanging well below the collar. Time after time, the coach caught Van Zant and his friends violating the rules, sending them straight to the principal's office and often earning them suspensions. The constant battles became legendary among the group. Eventually, guitarist Gary Rossington reached his breaking point. Frustrated with the endless lectures and disciplinary actions, he openly rebelled and walked away from school altogether. A few nights later, while performing at a local venue called the Forest Inn, Van Zant had an idea. At the time, the band was still performing under the name 1%. Looking out at the crowd, Van Zant knew many of the people in attendance had gone to Robert E. Lee High School. They all knew the strict gym coach who had made life miserable for the aspiring musicians. On a whim, Van Zant suggested changing the band's name to a playful variation of the coach's name. The crowd erupted with laughter and applause. The reaction was immediate. Just like that, Lynyrd Skynyrd was born. With a name that finally stuck and a sound growing stronger by the month, the band quickly became a fixture around Jacksonville. Their schedule was relentless. They would often play one venue for teenagers until midnight, then continue performing at adult bottle clubs until sunrise. The nights were long, the pay wasn't always great, but they were building a reputation one performance at a time. Around this same period, Van Zant's personal life was changing as well. In the mid-1960s, he met Nadine Insko, and the couple married in January 1967. Before long, they welcomed a daughter, Tammy. For a brief moment, it appeared as though Van Zant might leave his rock and roll ambitions behind. He took a steady job at his brother-in-law's auto parts store and reportedly became so knowledgeable that he memorized the entire parts catalog. But stability never seemed to fit him for long. The marriage eventually ended in 1969, and around that same time, Van Zant met Judy Seymour through Gary Rossington. Their relationship developed quickly, and a few years later, they married and welcomed a daughter named Melody. Meanwhile, Lynyrd Skynyrd continued pushing forward. By 1970, the band had recorded a demo strong enough to attract interest from Capricorn Records. To the surprise of many, Van Zant turned down the offer. Instead of chasing the first opportunity that came along, the band spent the next 3 years grinding through bars, clubs, and endless highway miles. They played anywhere that would have them, constantly refining their music and sharpening their stage presence. Slowly, everything began falling into place. Their equipment improved, their songwriting matured, their performances became tighter and more powerful. The sound that would eventually define Southern rock was taking shape. Ironically, Van Zant never fully embraced the Southern rock label. While he understood that their lyrics reflected Southern life and culture, he often argued that the band's musical influences came just as much from British rock groups as they did from American acts. In his mind, Lynyrd Skynyrd owed as much to bands like Free as they did to any Southern tradition. Regardless of how the music was categorized, the hard work finally paid off. In 1973, MCA Records approached the band with a far more attractive recording contract. This time, Van Zant accepted. The decision changed everything. Soon afterward, Lynyrd Skynyrd released their debut album, pronounced Lay Nerd Skynyrd. The record introduced audiences to songs that would become rock classics, including Tuesday's Gone, Simple Man, and Freebird. Few people could have predicted what Freebird would become. During live performances, Van Zant often asked audiences what song they wanted to hear. The answer was almost always the same. As crowds shouted for Freebird, the band would launch into a sprawling, electrifying performance that stretched well beyond 10 minutes. The song became more than a hit. It became a cultural phenomenon. Years later, audiences at concerts by completely different artists would still shout for Freebird as a tribute to the band's legacy. At the center of it all stood Van Zant, barefoot on stage, completely at home in front of thousands of fans. Yet behind the success, another side of his personality remained impossible to ignore. Van Zant possessed a notoriously explosive temper. Stories of fights, confrontations, and reckless behavior followed the band almost everywhere they went. One infamous incident involved a table being thrown from a second-story hotel window. Another ended with Van Zant and Gary Rossington badly beaten after confronting a group of men outside their tour bus in San Francisco. The injuries were severe enough that Van Zant began wearing sunglasses on stage to conceal the damage. Ironically, the look only added to his growing mystique. His intensity extended to the band itself. He demanded discipline and total commitment. If he felt someone wasn't focused during a performance, he wasn't afraid to make his displeasure known immediately. His leadership style could be harsh, but it helped forge Lynyrd Skynyrd into one of the tightest live acts in rock music. By the mid-1970s, the band had developed a reputation for hard living. Heavy drinking, frequent fights, and chaotic backstage behavior became part of their public image. Rather than hide those stories, people around the band often encouraged them, believing they added to the group's legend. But the lifestyle was beginning to take its toll. By 1976, Van Zant had already accumulated numerous arrests, and tensions within the band were growing. Friends and colleagues often described him as a man capable of incredible warmth one moment and frightening anger the next. Despite the turmoil, the band's success continued to soar. Following their debut, Lynyrd Skynyrd released a string of successful albums and major hits, including Sweet Home Alabama. Yet even as their fame grew, warning signs were appearing. That same year, both Alan Collins and Gary Rossington were involved in serious automobile accidents linked to alcohol and drug use. Rossington's crash was especially devastating, causing major damage and forcing the band to cancel performances. Van Zant was furious. Although relieved that his friends had survived, he believed their reckless behavior threatened everything the band had worked for. Determined to send a message, he fined both men and channeled his frustration into a new song. That song became That Smell. Its lyrics warned of the dangers of excess, addiction, and self-destruction. Van Zant hoped the message would force his bandmates to reconsider their choices before it was too late. At the time, it sounded like a cautionary tale. Soon, however, those haunting words would take on a far darker meaning than anyone could have imagined when Ronnie predicted his death. Back in 1995, Ronnie Van Zant's father, Lacey, shared a memory about his son that still sends chills down the spine. Sitting back in his recliner, he reflected on something that had set Ronnie apart from his other children. In Lacey's eyes, Ronnie possessed what old-timers sometimes called second sight. Whether it was intuition, fate, or simply a man speaking his deepest fears out loud, Ronnie had spent years telling those closest to him that he would never live to see his 30th birthday. The unsettling part was that he didn't say it just once. He said it over and over again. Lynyrd Skynyrd drummer Artemis Pyle remembered one night in Tokyo when the band was unwinding at a bar, drinking sake after another performance. Out of nowhere, Ronnie calmly told him that he wasn't going to make it to 30. Pyle immediately brushed it off, convinced it was just drunken talk. But Ronnie remained serious. He insisted that when his time came, he wanted to go out with his boots on. Others heard the same prediction. Kevin Elson, Skynyrd's soundman, who would later produce major acts like Journey and Night Ranger, recalled Ronnie making similar comments countless times. Elson believed Ronnie's outlook may have stemmed from the way he lived his life. Ronnie attacked every day at full speed, burning brightly and refusing to slow down. To those around him, it reminded them of other rock icons who had died young after living just as intensely. Even more disturbing, Ronnie wasn't the only one carrying a sense of dread. Assistant road manager Dean Kilpatrick had reportedly voiced similar feelings, admitting to friends that he had a strange sense he wasn't going to make it. At first, people around them grew tired of hearing these predictions. It became one of those things Ronnie said often enough that others stopped taking it seriously. But as 1977 unfolded and Ronnie's 30th birthday drew closer, his warnings became harder to ignore. Then came October. On October 17, 1977, Lynyrd Skynyrd released Street Survivors and prepared to embark on what should have been another triumphant tour. The original album cover featured the band standing in the middle of a city street surrounded by flames. 3 days later, that image would take on a haunting new meaning. On October 20th, Ronnie Van Zant and his bandmates boarded a Convair CV-240 bound for their next performance. Even before takeoff, concerns surrounded the aircraft. Kevin Elson later admitted there had been previous issues with the plane. Mechanics had inspected it, but ultimately the band trusted the pilots and moved forward. Looking back, Elson would later say that all the warning signs had been there. There had been other strange moments in the months leading up to the flight. Backup singer JoJo Billingsley noticed that Ronnie had started referring to himself as the Mississippi Kid, despite being born and raised in Florida. At the time, the nickname made little sense. Tragically, Mississippi would become forever tied to his story. The aircraft itself raised concerns. The Convair 240 had been built in 1948 and had accumulated more than 29,000 flight hours. Earlier that same year, members of Aerosmith's team had reportedly refused to use the plane because they felt uncomfortable with its condition. Cassie Gaines was among those hesitant to board. Still, Ronnie encouraged everyone to get on. With his familiar mix of humor and fatalism, he reportedly remarked that if it was someone's time to go, then it was simply their time. Soon, Ronnie Van Zant, Alan Collins, Steve Gaines, Cassie Gaines, Gary Rossington, Billy Powell, Leon Wilkson, Artemis Pyle, Leslie Hawkins, and the rest of the crew settled into their seats. At 4:02 p.m., the Convair departed from Greenville, South Carolina, headed for Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Everything initially seemed routine. Pilot Walter McCreary filed the flight plan, checked the weather, informed controllers that the aircraft carried enough fuel for roughly 5 hours, and took off. Then, approximately 2.5 hours into the flight, everything changed. McCreary contacted Houston Air Traffic Control with alarming news. The plane was critically low on fuel. Controllers immediately cleared the flight to divert toward Macomb Airport in Mississippi. Even then, McCreary tried to avoid declaring a full emergency, asking only for the most direct route possible. Less than a minute later, another transmission came through. The aircraft had run out of fuel. Houston requested confirmation. The pilot's response was confused and strained. Then there was silence. No further communication ever came from the plane. Inside the cabin, most passengers had no idea how serious the situation had become. Keyboardist Billy Powell later recalled that people had been relaxing, playing cards, or resting until the crew warned them to prepare for impact. Artemis Pyle, who had some flight experience, immediately began instructing everyone on how to brace themselves. Before returning to his seat, Ronnie Van Zant approached Pyle and shook his hand. It was a simple gesture, a goodbye, without words. Despite the terror of the moment, survivors later remembered an eerie calm settling over the cabin. Rather than panic, many prayed quietly as they waited for whatever came next. For nearly 10 agonizing minutes, the powerless aircraft glided through the sky. Then it descended into the dense woods outside Gillsburg, Mississippi. Billy Powell later described the sensation of the plane striking the treetops. It felt violent and relentless, as though the aircraft was being tossed and battered from every direction. Pine trees, towering nearly 80 feet high, ripped into the Convair as it tore through the forest. According to the official accident report, the aircraft plowed hundreds of feet through the woods. The wings were ripped away. The cockpit slammed directly into a tree, killing pilots Walter McCreary and William Gray instantly. The fuselage split apart. Inside, chaos erupted. Seats tore loose from the floor. Passengers were struck by flying debris. The roof of the aircraft peeled open, throwing people and belongings into the surrounding wilderness. Eventually, the wreckage ground to a halt in a dark, swampy stretch of forest. Billy Powell managed to crawl from the twisted remains of the plane. As he looked around, he realized entire sections of the aircraft had been destroyed. He then became aware of his own injuries. His nose had been badly damaged and blood covered his face. Overwhelmed by shock, he sat atop the wreckage in tears until cries for help shattered the silence. Leon Wilkeson was trapped inside. Others were calling out in agony. Powell immediately began helping survivors. He wrapped his torn shirt around his injuries and joined Artemis Pyle and road crew member Ken Peden in searching for assistance. Pyle himself was severely injured. The force of the crash had knocked off his shoes, and his socks hung loose around his feet. Yet, despite the pain, the men pushed through thick brush and dense woods until they reached the nearby farm of Johnny Mote. Mote had heard the crash from his home. At first, seeing injured strangers emerge from the woods, he feared they were escaped convicts and fired a warning shot into the air. But once he understood what had happened, his focus shifted entirely to helping the survivors. By the time rescue teams arrived, 6 people had lost their lives: pilots Walter McCreary and William Gray, assistant road manager Dean Kilpatrick, Steve Gaines, Cassie Gaines, and Ronnie Van Zant. He was just 29 years old. Only 87 days separated him from his 30th birthday. Ronnie Van Zant utterly hated Neil Young. Now, we finally know why. For all the larger-than-life personalities that have passed through rock and roll, few rivalries have become as legendary or as misunderstood as the one between Lynyrd Skynyrd and Neil Young. The truth is, it's nearly impossible to overstate just how much both artists shaped the sound of an entire generation. Lynyrd Skynyrd took the soul of the American South and transformed it into something electrifying. They blended country storytelling, blues grit, and hard-driving rock into a sound that felt both rebellious and deeply rooted in where they came from. Songs like Freebird, Gimme 3 Steps, and That Smell didn't just become hits, they became anthems. Meanwhile, Neil Young was carving out his own remarkable legacy. Whether as a member of Buffalo Springfield, part of Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, or through his acclaimed solo career, Young built a reputation as one of rock's most respected songwriters. Decades later, he would still be recording, touring, and speaking his mind without apology. And that willingness to speak openly is exactly what led to one of rock's most fascinating feuds. Neil Young had never been shy about politics or social issues. His worldview had been shaped in part by his Canadian upbringing and more liberal perspective. Looking at the United States from the outside, particularly the American South, he often viewed many of its traditions and political attitudes as outdated and troubling. That perspective eventually found its way into his music. Ironically, before any controversy ever erupted, Ronnie Van Zant had been one of Neil Young's biggest admirers. The Lynyrd Skynyrd frontman openly praised Young's work and frequently wore Neil Young t-shirts on stage during performances. He respected Young as both an artist and songwriter. To Ronnie, Young wasn't just another musician. He was someone whose work genuinely inspired him. That admiration made what happened next feel deeply personal. In 1970, Neil Young released Southern Man on his landmark album, After the Gold Rush. The song confronted racism in the South, addressing painful subjects like slavery and the Ku Klux Klan. Young painted a harsh portrait of the region, challenging listeners to reckon with its history. Many people praised the song for its message. Others, especially in the South, felt attacked. To Ronnie Van Zant and countless Southern listeners, Southern Man painted an entire region with the same brush. They believed Young had reduced millions of people to stereotypes, condemning everyone for the sins of a few. As criticism mounted, Young explained that his intentions were tied more closely to the civil rights movement than to condemning Southern people as a whole. But for many, the damage had already been done. Then came round 2. 2 years later, Young revisited similar themes with Alabama. Although he later suggested the song was more personal than political, and that the state itself served as a symbol rather than a direct target, many listeners didn't see much difference. For those already upset by Southern Man, Alabama felt like another shot aimed squarely at their way of life. Ronnie Van Zant eventually addressed the controversy himself. From his perspective, Young had gone too far in trying to make his point. While Van Zant had no tolerance for racism or injustice, he believed Young had unfairly condemned an entire population in the process. He saw a distinction between acknowledging the South's flaws and dismissing the people who called it home. Rather than continuing the argument through interviews alone, Van Zant answered the criticism the way musicians often do best. He wrote a song. That response became Sweet Home Alabama. The track celebrated Southern identity while pushing back against what Skynyrd viewed as unfair characterizations. At the center of it all was one of the most famous lines in rock history, directly referencing Neil Young and making it clear that Lynyrd Skynyrd had heard every word of his criticism. The song became a defining moment for the band. But what happened afterward is what truly makes this story remarkable. Instead of allowing bitterness to grow, Neil Young eventually reconsidered his own words. Over time, he admitted that the lyrics in Alabama hadn't expressed his thoughts as clearly or fairly as he intended. Looking back, he acknowledged that the song came across as accusatory and condescending, and that its message had been too easily misunderstood. It was a rare moment of humility from a major artist. Even more surprising, Young embraced Sweet Home Alabama rather than resenting it. He praised the song and the band behind it, recognizing the passion and sincerity in their response. Far from holding a grudge, he admired the fact that Lynyrd Skynyrd stood up for what they believed. Years later, he even joked that having his name immortalized in one of rock's greatest songs wasn't such a bad thing. Young would go on to perform Sweet Home Alabama himself on occasion, treating the so-called feud with humor rather than hostility. By then, the two sides had found common ground. In an extraordinary gesture of reconciliation, Young sent Lynyrd Skynyrd a demo of Powderfinger and encouraged them to record it for an upcoming album. It could have marked the beginning of a completely new chapter between the former rivals, but fate had other plans. In October 1977, tragedy struck when Ronnie Van Zant and several members of Lynyrd Skynyrd were killed in a devastating plane crash. The band never had the opportunity to record Powderfinger. The song would later become one of Neil Young's most celebrated compositions, but listeners would always wonder what it might have sounded like through Ronnie Van Zant's voice. Only weeks after the crash, Young took the stage at a charity concert in Miami and delivered an emotional tribute. During the performance, he blended Alabama with Sweet Home Alabama, honoring the musicians who had once challenged him so publicly. It's one of rock and roll's great ironies. What began as a disagreement over politics, identity, and regional pride never descended into lasting hatred. Beneath the headlines and famous lyrics, there remained a mutual respect between two artists who cared deeply about their beliefs and weren't afraid to defend them. In the end, Ronnie Van Zant and Neil Young didn't allow a feud to define their relationship. They buried the hatchet before tragedy intervened.